Welcome again. And just to remind everyone, just keep the microphones off in the meantime unless it's time to take questions from the floor. Again, our topic for today is the impact of COVID on wages and inequality. We have a speaker today. I'll introduce him a bit later. But just to explain a bit the workshop, okay. I'll have two questions for our speaker, and then we'll give him a chance to give a short answer. And then after each question, we can open the floor for questions from the participants. And then after those two questions, if there's more time, we can have additional questions. Although we have to end exactly at 1 hour's time because our speaker has a next commitment. So anyway, it's great to have Patrick Belser to speak to us today. He is a senior economist at the International Labor Office. So Patrick, my first question, in the video, you mentioned and described the worsening wage inequality across the world. Did inequality worsen or improve during the pandemic? And did any new trends appear?
Hello, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I think you are located in Europe, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe you're located all over the place. So it's great to be able to meet virtually, and very nice to have this opportunity to interact. As Benji said, I'm the coordinator of the wage group in Geneva, and a senior economist. I'm a specialist in matters related to wage policies, and in particular, we work a lot with my group on issues related to minimum wages, but we also publish the Global Wage Report. So the Global Wage Report is a flagship report of the ILO. It's being published every 2 years. And this is basically, in the process of producing this report, that we do a lot of research, try and identify new trends, and also do a lot of data analysis. We collect data from as many countries as possible, and we look at the evolution of wages. And of course, now with the COVID situation, we try to understand how people were impacted by the COVID crisis, and in particular by the labor market and the economic dimensions of this human catastrophe. And what we did notice indeed is that the COVID-19 crisis and the related policy measures and lockdowns, etc., have contributed to an increase in inequalities. And early on in the crisis, I think we all agreed that the COVID was really highlighting existing inequalities. It was putting them into very sharp light. It's suddenly became very evident what the catastrophic consequences were of all these people, basically half of the world population, 55% of the population who are not covered by any form of social protection. So, you don't have health coverage, you don't have sick leave when you're sick, no income replacement, no social protection in case of a pandemic like we had. And I think this is the first thing that we observed really is the growing awareness, I would say, the realization of many people of these enormous inequalities that we have in the world that were there before. But I think there was a bit less awareness of the importance and of the human consequences that this inequality can have. So, I would say the same about the level of informality in the different countries. At the ILO, we have estimated that 60%, 61.2% to be precise, of the working population work in the informal economy. And they also people who are very exposed to risk. They have no adequate protection. They have no access to health services. They have also no social protection associated with their jobs, and suddenly became very visible what the implications were. And so that was, I think, the first thing that we observed. But then now, I think we have more and more evidence as well that levels of inequalities, and in particular income inequalities, have been further increased by the COVID-19 crisis. First of all, because a lot of the sectors that were affected by lockdowns were sectors with many relatively low-paid workers from low-income families. So there were like construction, restaurants, the hospitality sector. So these people working in those sectors were hit particularly hard. And also because many people with relatively low wages did not have the possibility to continue working from home. And so we had a big expansion of what we call teleworking in the ILO, which is home office or working from home. And I think up to 25% of workers in Europe were able to continue working from home. But these people were in relatively higher paid occupations. And so that further increased inequalities. In the Global Wage Report, we estimated that those people in the lower half of the wage distribution lost about 17% of their wages in 2020, when the first year of the COVID, compared to about 6% for workers overall. And so you have a disproportionate impact on low-paid workers. And we can also safely say that the impact of the crisis has also been more severe on women than on men. At least, for those countries where we have estimates, we find that women have lost a greater proportion of their wages than men. And that is not really surprising, because the same sectors which have many low-paid occupations also have many women. And in general, women are overrepresented in low-paid sectors and occupations. So, that is a reality. The ILO estimated that more than 250 million jobs were lost in the first year of the crisis, and definitely a majority of them were low-paid workers. And actually, that brings me to the third part of your question, which was really, did any new trends appear? And when we looked at the evolution of average wages, we saw that in 2020, something a bit strange happened, is that in many countries, we saw that average wages have tended to increase compared to 2019. So looking at the data from national statistical offices, we saw an increase, 4% in the US, sometimes more, sometimes less, but very counterintuitive. And finally, the explanation was quite simple. The explanation was that those people who have lost their jobs were mostly low-paid workers. And so when you compare, 2020 with 2019, you take the average of a higher paid group of workers in 2020, and therefore the average wage is higher in 2020 than in 2019. And so we had to explain this to our Director General. We had to explain, because just before we launched the Global Wage Report, in fact, that was at a time where Donald Trump was still president in the USA, and he said, in the USA, everything is well, wages are increasing 4%, so, my policies are really good. And so just minutes before the press conference launch with our Director General, he came to us and said, what's going on here? Was something really, wages are going up. You're saying that things are inequalities are increasing and people losing their wages. So what's the reality here? And I think these trends sort of confused many people. It confused us in the beginning. But it's got something to keep in mind also when you see the evolution of average wages in the press. Now, for example, in the United States, you may have actually many low-paid workers coming back into the labor market, and so kind of depressing putting the average wage level back to where it was before the crisis. And so sometimes the average wages is not such a great indicator of what's actually going on if it's not being properly decomposed. So I would stop here for your first question, Benji.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, for that great recap of basically what has happened to wages and also to inequality during the pandemic. So we open the floor to questions from our participants. Anybody wish to ask Patrick? Yeah, anybody?
Is that on that particular issue, Benji, or on any issue?
Well, for now, for what you've said, well, maybe a follow-up, and then we'll ask again our participants. Again, going back to the experience of the pandemic, what measures to promote decent work and also to improve wage equality do you think has been highlighted, okay, because of everything that has happened during COVID-19?
Yes, a very good question, actually, because what we noticed, and I think many people noticed, and maybe I'm sure you've noticed that as well, in observing what was going on in different parts of the world, is that there was an unprecedented measure of proactiveness on the parts of governments during the COVID crisis. And many governments have implemented policies which which perhaps were not on the agenda, and which certainly they had not foreseen to adopt or implement so quickly, where it's not for the crisis. And of course, one of the area which is very high up on the agenda is the universalization of social protection, because we've seen that in many countries, social protection measures were reinforced. The access to health services, income support measures, extension also of unemployment benefits to groups that were not covered previously. There were a number of job retention measures also put in place, which overall have been very costly, and because they have been very unique, and I think in some countries exceeding 15 or 20% of GDP. I don't have the figures exactly in my head, but these were really an unprecedented set of measures. And one challenge that we feel at the ILO, certainly to try and encourage member states to make some of these measures more permanent, within, of course, the concern of its financial sustainability. But I think we've made an argument for a long time that social protection for all, or a social protection floor for everybody, is something that would not necessarily be so costly, and it would be something of huge benefit for the people and the citizens of all the countries on the planet. And so certainly now there is a lot of momentum to work on this universality of social protection, and the United Nations and a lot of agencies are actually also pushing into the same direction. And so here we certainly have an encouraging development, which because of this unpredictable event has put lights on a problem that we all have and that we now know is possible to solve because of what all the states have done during the COVID. Of course, not all the measures that were put in place are of a permanent nature, and some of them are temporary, but I would like to highlight one of them in particular, which is the issue of the wage subsidies. So a lot of countries have implemented temporary wage subsidies, and we have published a little note on this, which is basically support from the states to help enterprises pay workers in a period of crisis for up to a certain period of time in order to prevent enterprises from separating with the workers. So it preserves the jobs. It ensures that people can stay with their employer and that employer can keep their workers for a certain period, maybe 1 year or a year and a half, or 2 years, I don't know, it depends on the country. And that when the crisis is over, the enterprise and the workers still have a job, and the enterprises still have a productive set of employees. They don't need to hire new people. And so here we have quite an interesting contrast between some countries. The countries where these wage subsidies did not exist, people were basically fired. And I'm thinking of the United States when I look at rich countries. In the US, the response has been for employers to separate with workers, and there was a huge increase in unemployment temporarily. And then those people come back into the labor market and the unemployment rate goes down. But, people change employers, they change jobs, and now a lot of employers also have difficulties to find the right qualified and skilled workers. And then you have the experience of other countries like Germany, for example, which is perhaps the exemplary country with wage subsidies, where basically the state compensated 2/3, I think it was, of the wages of the workers who worked in enterprises where working time was lost. So, say they had a full-time job, it became a part-time job. The enterprise paid the 50% of the job, and the state paid 2/3 of the wages for the other 50%, which basically lost working time. And so this was a very effective way. It's also costly. We have to admit it's a costly policy. But it ensured that when the recovery slowly got on the way, the enterprises still have their workers still have a job, and the machine, the economic machine, can resume progressively in a relatively smooth way. And I want to emphasize here that we've also worked with many countries across the world on this issue of wage subsidies, and so it's not just rich countries, it's countries all over the world. We've worked with Ethiopia, for example, but there are also other countries, Brazil, Botswana, Myanmar, and many more, where the wage subsidy schemes have tended to be more targeted to particular groups of workers. So the textile and garment industry was one of them, where you have a lot of workers, a lot of women workers in many countries, and where suddenly, all these enterprises, these big brands, which had actually ordered some materials, clothing and trousers and T-shirts, did actually cancel these orders, and where it was expected that these factories would not have any work for their workers for at least 6 months or 1 year. And so in Ethiopia, and for example, we helped the government set up such a wage subsidy scheme in order to ensure that workers in these enterprises were able to survive. Because when you don't have a social security, you don't have social protection, and you don't have a wage, then your situation becomes very precarious. And so that was a very interesting experience, I think, in terms of learning from the crisis on what can be interesting and useful policy measures. Of course, these are temporary measures, no, as opposed to the social protection, which is a measure where you want to have everybody covered by social protection. Here, the wage subsidy is more a policy that you can use in times of crisis. And we now know that it's a useful tool. It can be used. It works quite well. But you have to be prepared as a country to put it in place quickly and effectively when you have a crisis. And so what we also saw is that those countries which had some experience with these policies, they had an administration who knew how to manage it. They had some networks in place. They had some experience with it. They were able to put it in place much quicker. And so this experience now that we had in a lot of countries, I think will be very useful in the future. Not necessarily when there is a pandemic. It may just be a recession. It may be, maybe a crisis linked to oil prices in Russia. It may be different sorts of crisis, but that was a very I think worthwhile studying these schemes and keeping the knowledge of what happened in order to inform and be able to use some of these policies again when they will be needed.
Yeah, just to add to that, in the Philippines, there was an ad hoc wage subsidy program set up just because of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And of course, that contrast with Germany's wage subsidy program set up even before the pandemic, right? So I guess that made for a better response. Yeah.
But still, I mean, I'm sure that the ad hoc program in the Philippines was an extremely useful program.
Yeah. Yeah, it did help
many people.
A couple of million workers. It reached a couple of million. Although that's compared to 40 million in total. Although not all of them lost their jobs.
And we have to say, also as another caveat that, of course, these schemes work with formal type of enterprises that are registered with registered workers. Mm-hmm. That's tend to be workers with a social security number,
or in the case of in a payroll list, because the workers were on a payroll list, so they could be identified. Yeah, informal workers are another different thing entirely. Yeah. I think Yen has a question. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick, for, if I may ask, for very interesting input and also an overview pictures of the reactions of the other governments in the whole world about how they coping with the pandemic. But I think, you also mentioned the very good example of Germany. They have wage subsidized with what is called so-called Kurzarbeitsgeld, short-term work subsidized for the companies, which is 70% for every single work employer when they don't have kids, and 78% when they have kids. And in some very good examples with the companies in the car factory that they even subsidize until 89% of the wage subsidized for the short-term work. But also for enterprises, it's a kind of a loan that they will have to pay back later. But this pandemic also very calling for good example that it could work well, especially, and it shows how important the safety nets, the social security is in each countries. But that's a good example. There's also a bad example that the workers, if they stop working, they have no income in developing countries, and also that women, female employers, they have to be they have to be in, in a hospital receiving COVID patient when they are pregnant and so on. There's also a lot of cases that because we can't stop working. And the question is, how long can the government still bear this, these temporaries, and how can they are working over now their capacity, and how long can they still bear this pandemics, and how and the threatening is still there to the employees. How would you see, from the point of view, the trends toward the end of the year and in the next 2 or 3 years, in short term, to see how we could cope with this? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, that's a difficult one. Well, first, I think that a lot of countries are phasing out programs now. Like the programs of furlough in the UK, or the many of the wage subsidies have been phased out already. In terms of the social protection and social security, I think the debate is a bit different. Is really the debate is about what part of the measures that were put in place could be made more permanent, and what part has been an ad hoc response to an unprecedented catastrophe. And here I see contradictory forces coming into play a bit. On the one hand, we have the risk of being again after the global financial and economic crisis of 2008. I think it was. We had this austerity, ideology coming back onto the marketplace. I was going to say, and so with a lot of course, of cutbacks in social programs, with an emphasis on reducing debt and reducing budget deficits very, very quickly. And no doubt, this there's a good chance that this is coming back as well in the next years, in the next couple of years. On the other hand, what I see with social security issue, I also see the social protection. I also see proposals within the United Nations for a gigantic fund, global fund, who could actually contribute to some of these efforts. There is even debates that the IMF could use its special drawing rights to fund the basic social protection, the universalization of basic social protection. And so there is a lot of thinking going around, I think, about original funding mechanisms and new ideas on how this could be put in place. And nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but I'm hopeful that this is going to lead to a significant change, and that we're going to have a post-COVID world, which will be a world with much wider coverage in terms of social protection than before. Now, of course, it's just my sort of optimistic view and my hope. But the fact that the IMF gets involved, that there is really also a consensus at the United Nations level between the different institutions is already something that is very positive. Yes, I see George has a question.
I think Aisha raised her hand first, and then George. Okay, Aisha, and then George. We cannot hear you, Aisha. Yeah, we cannot hear you. There must be some problem with Aisha's. Well, while we wait for Aisha, I'll call on George in the meantime. Then I'll get back to you, Aisha.
You will type
Yes,
it.
George.
So thank you so much. Patrick, I appreciate this presentation. Thank you so much. But you just mentioned some efforts that have been making at global level, where we're talking about even the IMF getting involved in the issue of social security. But that frightens me, because I know of IMF with these austerity measures that are driving public services out of proportion, and all of that, and bringing IMF in to social security issues. I don't know how will we reconcile this, and if I don't know if I'm the only person who's seeing the danger that is ahead of us, and I don't know how we can graduate from this. And actually, I was thinking also, how is the ILO able to utilize these data that you are collecting and seeing the inequality between countries and people and all of that, when the ILO itself is non clothed with the authority to impose on countries to practicalize whatever the ILO puts out as a policy. And if you look at the dynamics, you will see that the countries that are doing well are already doing well with this data that we are seeing. And it is those countries which are not abiding by the protocols that are not really doing well. So the device is there. Those who choose to implement the conventions and protocols, they are doing well. Those who are not doing, they are not doing well. And we're still finding these, nice policies coming out of the ILO. And I'm just wondering, how are we able to use them to better the lives of people in those countries that are not applying the policies?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, of course, you are right about your worry that if the IMF comes into play and tries to sell its philosophy on social protection to the countries across the world, the result might not be the one that I have just been presenting and discussing previously. And it is true that the IMF and the ILO have very different philosophies and approaches towards social protection. That the idea of the social protection floor is also based on the idea that there is a redistributive element in social protection, and so we are far from a philosophy where everybody will have its own savings and that would be your social protection. But I think the initiative that I have heard about is, but I think these are talks, and maybe I haven't fully understood what is going on, but I don't know if anybody has a full picture. But it would be that countries would be authorized to use their special drawing rights for the purpose of developing social protection programs, and these programs would be it doesn't it's not linked to a conditionality that the IMF would put in place that these programs would look like XYZ. So it's more like the debate about the right to access these resources from the IMF to actually develop social protection in a way that the United Nations is also promoting it, and the UN Secretary General, I think, is playing a very important role in these initiatives. So that's one of the. That's my reaction to your first question. What do we do with all of these nice experiments and all that knowledge that we accumulate? Since we're not able to impose it on countries. So, of course, that's a limitation that the ILO has. This being said, I think that the system of conventions and recommendations is an interesting one, because those countries that have ratified these conventions, they do have some obligations to report and to comply with the conventions, and so trade unions and others can send complaints to the ILO, and the ILO will try and and convince the governments to actually take remedial action. Of course, you might think it's a soft measure, but on the other hand, when you see the reaction sometimes within the ILO to this naming and shaming, you realize it does matter to most countries in the world. There may be some countries which don't care, maybe some countries which are on the fringes of the community of states don't really give much interest, but for many others they don't like it when the ILO is criticizing, and it's it's been one way to promote change. And then on the other hand, there are also many countries who would like the ILO support to develop some of these policies and measures, and they need technical advice. They need the ILO to bring its experience, because those countries do not have experience in running some of these programs, and you have a lot of countries where governments would be more than willing to have universal social protection if it was affordable and if it could be done in a way that that is effective and financially sustainable. So that's that's also one way that we work. But yeah, you're right. In the end, we are part of the United Nations, and our members are sovereign states and countries, and they don't want to delegate to a supranational authority some of these things. So that is the reality in which we live and work.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, this is not a question, but just to put it out there, in the Philippines, there are unions, for example, who are calling for universal basic income, universal health care, and also universal job guarantees are as part of new social protection measures. Mm-hmm. And then they're calling for wealth taxes in order to fund those of course, robust programs. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so yeah, that not really a question, just to inform everybody. And Aisha's question is, Patrick mentioned the impact was greater on women who especially work in low-paid occupations. One example is health and social care, where pay for social care is particularly low. So the question is, have there been measures in some countries that you identified to subsidize these sectors and boost the morale of these mainly female workers?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question as well, and we have not done a systematic review of such measures yet, but we are in the process of doing this. The ILO publishes different flagship reports. So the Global Wage Report is one of them, but another one is called the WESO, which is the World Employment and Social Outlook. So we know it by WESO, so we know it by its acronym. And the next one is going to be on essential workers, and so both on documenting the working conditions of essential workers, but also some of the measures that have been taken to improve their working conditions, because there has been a lot of awareness of the importance of essential workers and of their relatively poor working conditions in many instances. I know that there are countries where there have been state subsidies that have been added to their wages in order to thank them as a kind of a bonus to the wage. But of course, we also would like to see changes in lasting and sustainable changes in the level of wages of some of these workers. And we are also preparing a joint report with the WHO on the wages and working conditions in the health and care sector, and where we are documenting also the gender pay gap in that sector, where women tend to earn 20% less than men, also in that sector, and where they tend to also be concentrated in lower paid occupations, and have more limited access to more highly paid occupations. And so that's something that we're doing with the WHO, and we are hoping that together we can have a real impact. So that's what I can say at the moment.
So yeah, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, Cheng.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. It's very nice. It looks like we are taking you as a dictionary to look at how the word's going on. I just want to have a few comments and one question as well. And I'm not sure whether you notice in this kind of like crisis measures, some of the countries, especially East Asia, and they it's not new, but they used to use so much of the consumption coupons. And the point is like depend on country by country, because some of the countries actually, if you are doing the cash transfer, depend on the country. For example, taking the case of China, our saving rate is quite high. Of course, this also related to other social fund as well, but our saving is quite high. So the conservative ideology was like we are not able to do the cash transfer, but we could actually to boost the consumption. So we distribute the consumption coupons to the ordinary people, and then they could actually consuming, so guarantee the whole production are still running. So in such a way, they could actually guarantee the guarantee of the jobs of the workers in all the productions. So I want to know how do you think this? Also, another thing also I would like to ask as well is as Benji was also mentioned, the universal basic income. This is already being advocated by many scholars as well, organizations. And I'm not sure how ILO is viewed this, especially after this pandemic. The last one thing is I just want to mention a little bit to Aisha's question was also, it's not general to female workers, but it's a sad news here in Brazil as well. And they used to have this like a conditional cash transfer. We call Bolsa Familia. It's like the fund to the poor family household, and it has very good initiative because the money was conditional on the children's schooling, on the children's health checkup, and the money was direct to go to send to the female household rather than to male. So that was a really good programs and been running for more than 10 years. Unfortunately, this year, by this conservative government, they actually they changed the name. They changed to Brasilia Bolsa, but more or less we would predict it's going to cut the whole program. It's a very sad news. Yeah, but also very interesting to know if and there are other measures to actually target direct to the female workers. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So on the consumption coupon, I'm not aware of much research in the ILO or any particular assessment of the effectiveness of such coupons versus other income support measures or consumption measures. But what I can say is that the same coupons were also in circulation here in Geneva, in Switzerland. And so you had at the local level, enterprises and supermarkets and restaurants who could participate in the scheme. And through the local authorities, actually people got up to a certain amount of coupons, and they could decide where they wanted to spend these coupons. And so I think it's I think it works well in the sense that 100% of the support is then consumed, as opposed to you increase your savings with it. And here in that case, it was also very effective in supporting local establishments and workers, because you can tailor it so that actually you have to spend it in some of the establishments which are in your particular region and location. And of course, if you normally you cannot use it to go to H&M and then and give these big companies even more money. On the contrary, those companies who are eligible would be the local restaurants, would be the local bicycle shop, would be the local tennis club, restaurant, or whatever. And I thought it was a good system. But as I say, this is just my own personal thoughts on it. Universal basic income, that's a big elephant in the ILO as well. There are very different positions on these kind of proposals, and we've done work on the margins of rather documenting what has been going on in Finland and in other places, looking at what were the pros and the cons, and the design features, and of course, big question is does it replace all the other social protection measures, and so does it become regressive in a sense, or does it come on top, and how generous is it? So many questions here, which the ILO has just been observing at the moment. And on the political side, of course, the big worry is that that it's delinking protection from work, and so it is, it might reduce the urgency to create jobs and to pursue a policy of full employment, because one might think, well, people can just go and draw on the universal benefits, that's fine. And so this is a bit of there's a political worry, I would say. But on the other hand, we also all know that the world of work is changing, that people work on platforms, that people have different kind of jobs, are moving a lot between jobs. And some people think it's unavoidable that the ILO will have to enter more squarely into that discussion in the future. And we have elections for a new director general in the next couple of weeks, and so we will see what the new director general thinks about these issues, and it can, I think, it will be very central to the question of what the ILO is going to do with this question of the universal basic income. Then on the Belser Familia, I can only agree with you. It's sad if we are dismantling this flagship program, which has been an example used throughout the world, and it's been really one of the star programs that has been highlighted whenever there was a discussion on these kind of schemes, and which has contributed to reduce inequalities, to put children back to school, to, in combination with some of the measures like the minimum wage that was put in place also in Brazil at the time. The Belser Familia and the minimum wage really kind of credited with supporting growing incomes for relatively low income groups, and for succeeding in reducing inequalities and poverty in Brazil. And so it's really unfortunate if we dismantle this program.
Actually, in the Philippines, a similar program was started after it has been started in Brazil, a conditional cash transfer program too.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, do I see any questions? So yeah, from Gift.
Okay, thank you, Benji. It's quite an insightful discussion, and also it helps us to compare with what other regions were doing during the COVID period. But I would share from our perspective, from southern part of Africa, from Zimbabwe to be specific, you'd find that there were no measures that were put to cushion workers or employees that were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. You'd find that those that were on fixed-term contracts, you see, most of them, they just lost their jobs and they had no income for maybe for the period January 2020 to around mid 2021. These people had lost income at all because they had no income. Then those that were on contracts of a permanent nature, you see, it was left to them to decide between the individual employer and the employees how best they can sustain each other for the period of this pandemic. So what happened is that you'd find that workers were then forced to choose between losing your job in turn or agreeing to a pay cut. Because the simple reason was that we are not producing, we are on lockdown, and we are not doing anything. So it's either you keep your job and we give you a little bit for you to sustain yourself. So you'd find those were the kind of arrangements that were then made by individual companies and the workers. But on the other part now of the business side now, to say what was the response of the government in terms of cushioning the same employees, there was nothing. But however, our government, our Zimbabwean government, was quick to react to assist the business part. Yes, our economy in terms of inflation rates, the high inflation rates, our local currency is eroding every day. So what the government said is that for the business side, we will allow you for this period a reprieve for you to charge your goods and services in United States dollars. So you'd find that the company, for those companies like myself, I'm in the food industry. The food industry was an essential, said it's an essential service. So they were allowed to operate within that period. So you'd find that they were producing and selling their goods in foreign currency. Whereas the employee who was working was being given or was being paid in the local currency. So you had a mismatch here, where an employee would receive his salary and not able to buy the same products that he's making because he had no forex to do that. So the government was saying, no, we have made this provision as a way of preventing business from closure. They did not mind of what was going to happen to the employees, whatever could it. So the Zimbabwean scenario, because there were no social security safeness that the employees would be cushioned by. The National Social Security Authority was very quick to say, no, as an authority, we don't have any funds that we can assist workers on this period. They were saying that we are equally affected by the same pandemic, so we cannot assist in any way the workers. So at the end of the day, you'd find that in this part of the world, there was nothing that was meant or to cushion the employees. It was just an issue of losing wages for that period. And some, until today, some have failed even to go back to work, even on a full-time basis. And the arrangements still persist that they get a little bit with no other cushion from anyone else. I think that is the example that I wanted to share, an experience that I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, so no question their gift, right? But a sharing about what has happened in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that example. And I think it gives me also an opportunity to say that we had a discussion at the ILO in December of last year on the ILO's strategy to addressing inequalities in the world of work. So at the International Labour Conference, normally takes place in June, but it couldn't finish in June because of the COVID. So one session was in December, and it had been agreed that member states, governments, but of course also employers and workers would discuss in order to give directions to the ILO on working towards reducing inequalities in the world of work in the future. And in that meeting, of course, that meeting was initially foreseen already before the outbreak of the COVID, and it was focusing a lot on inequalities within countries, which has become a big topic, and where also it's part of SDGs objective to reduce inequalities, and it was really high on the agenda. Well, in this meeting in December, there was a lot of discussion about inequalities between countries, and really this topic has come back very strongly into the bodies of the ILO. The inequalities in terms of fiscal capacity to counteract the effect of the crisis, the inequalities in access to vaccine, this vaccine apartheid, as it was put by the South Africans and the Namibians, and so you're right to highlight the enormous differences that we need to acknowledge between the responses in different parts of the world, and also the importance of more cooperation and solidarity between countries, and maybe working towards the establishment of a fair world economy, which is also very important because. Of course, these inequalities between countries are very much entrenched in the existing world economic order, and that is something that came out very strongly from many countries in the South in the debates in December of last year.
Yeah, so with that, we have to close the workshop. Again, thank you, Patrick, for taking time and insightful comments and answers to the questions. Also to our participants for the sharing and the queries that you've asked Patrick. So yeah, with that, we say goodbye for now.